Now, here's the thing about federal power, ladies and gentlemen. You have to understand that our system of government actually operates under a policy or a theory, however you'd like to phrase it, called federalism. Okay, we have two layers of government in this country. Actually, we have more than two layers of government. Okay, we have the national government, headquartered in Washington D.C. Then here in California, we also have Sacramento. Okay, we have the state government. Plus, you get closer to home, we will have the government of San Joaquin County and the city of Ripon. And when you're physically at school, you're also under the authority of the Ripon Unified School District. So we do have multiple levels of government, and there are certain things that are exclusively the right of the federal government, that would be the national government, and there are different things that are only supposed to be at the state or local level. So the fact that you've got Teddy Roosevelt here wanting to go through and use federal power to correct different injustices that he saw, well, in some cases that's going to be pretty straightforward and it's going to be pretty simple and pretty easy to do. In other aspects of it, there may be a bit of a challenge because the question is whether or not the president or the federal government has the authority to do the various things that TR wanted to do. But keep in mind, I commented previously that he had said that as long as it wasn't expressly forbidden by the Constitution, he would do whatever he thought was in the best interest of the American people. And so TR is going to go through and he is going to try and use the power that he does have available to him as president to change things. Now, this is still a question that goes on today, questioning where the power of the federal government stops and the authority of the state government begins. And you can make all sorts of arguments about that. But in this case, we're just going to look at the way that TR went about using the power, the authority that he had as president to make the changes that he felt were required by the nation in order to continue to move forward. Now, TR is going to go down in history essentially as what's known as a trust buster. Okay, keep in mind, we talked about trusts previously. We talked about the fact that this was a large corporation or a collection of corporations who were working together to essentially control the market. Okay, they knew if they could control the market, then they could control the prices, and therefore they could make more money. Keep in mind, there is really not a lot of businesses that have come into existence without the express point being that they were going to make some money for the people who started the company. So what TR was going to do in this case was he wanted to use the power of the federal government to deal with the nation's problems. Now remember, I pointed out that Teddy Roosevelt had once said that as long as it wasn't expressly forbidden by the Constitution, then he would do anything if he thought it was in the best interest of the nation. And so TR is going to go through and he's going to use what power he does have to actually make the changes in regards to the various problems that he sees around the nation. Now, we did have some laws on the books. We talked about these before, things like the Sherman Antitrust Act, but in all honesty, they weren't really being used widely, okay? And so as a result, a lot of these big trusts were just continuing to grow, and it really meant that there were a lot of people that weren't getting a real good deal in regards to what they had to buy. Remember, if there is a trust, it essentially means there's no other game in town. You don't have somewhere else you can go. There's only one supplier, and you have to purchase from that individual. So keep in mind, trusts by definition, large companies that had control over the markets. Now, it didn't necessarily have to be just one company. It could be a collection of companies. It could be all the steel producers getting together to try and corner the market, or the copper producers, or whatever. But it was the idea that it was one large corporation or a number of people acting as one large corporation that are basically going to take control of the markets. Now, we live in a society where we have what's known as the free market. Okay, basically what that means is, people produce a product, they put it up for sale at ever how much. If people are willing to pay that amount, they will. If they're not, they won't. If they're not willing to pay that amount, then the producer has to figure out how to lower the cost and things like that. And between those two, between the buyer and the seller, they reach a point where both sides are at least happy enough with what they're actually doing. Now, in this case, when we're talking about the trusts, they are working very diligently, as I said, to try and control the market. Now, the way they did this was, first of all, they drove smaller companies out of business by lowering their own prices. Now, that might not seem like a wise choice. That may not seem very brilliant, or the term would be counterintuitive. It's the idea that, yes, they are producing whatever, and they're going to sell it for less money than it costs to produce it. They're going to sell at a loss. Now, generally speaking, that doesn't make a lot of sense unless you look at it with the idea of them trying to drive others out of the marketplace. What this would do is it would force the other smaller companies to also lower their price, or to even undercut whoever the trust was to try and get business. Now, all companies are in business to make a profit, and a profit is the amount of money that you make minus the amount of costs that you had. If you get to the point, if you're one of these small businesses and you cannot make a profit anymore, there really is no choice but to close your doors or to sell out to whomever the bigger company is. So that was the first thing they would do. They would drive these smaller companies out of business by dropping their prices. Now, once all the other producers, once all the other suppliers no longer existed, once they were gone, and you only had one game in town now, that meant they could put their price wherever they wanted. So first, they drive out the smaller companies by lowering their prices. Secondly, when they're all that's left, you could go through, and now if you were that company or you were that trust, you could jack your price up to whatever you felt like. And there wasn't anything anybody could do. You were the sole supplier of fill in the blank. And as such, if there were people who wanted to purchase steel or copper or whatever, it meant that they were going to have to go through you, and you got to choose whatever you wanted to charge for it. No longer were we talking about trying to find a good middle point between what the buyers wanted to spend and what the sellers wanted to charge. Now it was what the sellers wanted to charge, period, and if you didn't like it, well, that was your own problem. Now, by 1900, you're looking at trusts controlled somewhere in the range of 80% of all industries within the United States. And think about that. Think about the large number of trusts that were going on at this time. No matter where you turned, there was some kind of trust. There was some kind of big business that had essentially monopolistic, authority over whatever it was. There were, of course, still going to be small businesses. There were going to be those trying to go it on their own. But you think about it, 4 out of 5 businesses at this point in time were essentially trusts. And that's what concerned Teddy Roosevelt. Now, as I said, he's gone down in history as what's referred to as a trust buster. But to be more accurate, it would probably be a better way to say that he went down in history as a trust regulator. See, you got to understand, TR was not anti-business. In fact, he supported big business. What he wanted to stop were the trusts that were hurting people. Okay, he didn't really care that much about the businesses themselves. What he wanted to do was he wanted to go through and take action against those companies, against those trusts that were going through and they were charging an arm and a leg, that they were making life miserable for people, and they were limiting competition. That's what he wanted to do. Now, the trusts that weren't doing that, these big corporations that were not trying to squeeze people, he really didn't mind that much. Personally, he argued that he didn't care how much money a man made as long as he spent it, quote unquote, correctly. And I leave that up to you to figure out what that means. But he's going to go through and he wants to shut down those trusts that are basically causing harm to the American people. Not necessarily the economy. The economy was doing pretty good at this point in time. But the people themselves were hurting as a result of some of these business practices. And again, it wasn't all of them, it was just some of the trusts. And so TR is going to have the government sue those harmful trusts under the Sherman Antitrust Act. Now remember, we talked about that previously. It's a law that Congress had designed to try to make sure that no company was able to have a monopoly. And we've even seen this into current times. In the not too distant past, there was a federal lawsuit against Microsoft for being a monopoly. Just recently, we had a lawsuit has been brought by the Justice Department, the federal Justice Department, against Google as being a monopoly. So it's going to be very interesting to see how all that plays out. So TR wanted his Justice Department, he wanted the government to go through and use the Sherman Antitrust Act to go after these trusts that he felt were harming the American people. In fact, his government filed 44 different antitrust suits. That's how he came to be known as a trust buster. But think about it. Okay, we're looking at 44 antitrust suits. Yes, that is a lot, especially considering that the Sherman Antitrust Act really hadn't been used that much up until this point. But remember, we talked about the fact that 80% of all U.S. industries were controlled by trusts. So if there's only 44 antitrust suits, that means there's a lot of big business trusts and things like that that are going to be left alone. That's why it's better to argue that he was a trust regulator. Now, the book does use the term trust buster, so that's what I've gone with here. And it is true, he was trying to break up the bad trusts. But the ones that he saw as being good, as being beneficial, and helping the people of the United States, he was more than willing to leave those alone. It was just those trusts that he saw as being harmful that he sent the Department of Justice after. Now, in addition to TR wanting to go through and use the government to get rid of the bad trusts and whatnot, there are different issues that are going to come up that are going to have an effect on the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt. Now, every president has had various issues, problems, and whatnot crop up at different times that really nobody saw coming. Sometimes you could make the argument. You can go back, Jimmy Carter in the 70s, he suffered the problem of the American embassy being seized in Iran. You can look at present day with President Trump. I don't really think anyone saw a global pandemic hitting last March, but still in all, there are things that happen in any presidential administration that quite literally there's nothing you can do about except try and work through it as it happens. One of the big things like that for Teddy Roosevelt's administration happened in 1902 in regards to a coal strike. Now, keep in mind, this was a point in time when coal was the predominant fuel for heating homes, keeping factories running, and things like that, okay? There was a lot of steam power being used at that point in time, and a lot of that steam was being generated through the burning of coal. Now, you'll still find coal is used all over the world quite a bit today. There's a lot of coal-fired power plants, in places like China, for example, and there's some in the U.S. But the biggest thing at this point in time in 1902 was the fact that this is what people were going to use to heat their homes. Now, we don't really think about cold in regards to California. When I was in high school, it did drop down into the teens for a week, and that was like the end of the world. People, really seemed to almost panic over that. As a society in California, we seem to think that anything around 32 degrees is the end of life as we know it. So that's here. But you go back east, you go to different places around the country, and you can get some very, very cold temperatures, 0, below 0, things like that. And so coal in 1902 wasn't just what kept somebody's house warm for comfort. We're talking about legitimate need for survival at this point in time. Now, the problem was in 1902, you had about 140,000 coal miners went on strike in Pennsylvania. Now, they went on strike for a variety of reasons. The argument was they weren't being paid sufficiently, their hours were miserable, working conditions were poor. Coal mining, even to this very day, is still a very dangerous profession. You can have anything from mine collapses to fires to gases leaking in that kill people. I mean, it's a great variety of things. And especially at this point in time, you had a lot of what was referred to as black lung disease. Essentially, as people who were working in the mines were breathing in, little bits of coal dust were accumulating in their lungs and killing them. So you had these 140 coal miners really had enough. And they went out on strike and they were demanding changes to their working conditions. Now, we've said before that businesses exist because they want to make money. Now, the coal miner or the coal mine owners in this case were no different. They were there trying to make a profit. All right. And so as a result, even though the miners had gone out on strike, the mine owners flat out refused to negotiate with them. Okay, they had drawn a line in the sand, as it were. They had dug their heels in, and they were not going to negotiate. They felt that to do so would only encourage future issues like this. It would cause future strikes and more problems than it would solve. This is a point in time, remember, where really unionization was still in its very early stages. You still had a lot of questions as to what kind of authority the unions had. This was a point in time where unions still sometimes were sued under the Sherman Antitrust Act, believe it or not. And so as a result, the mine owners refused to negotiate. The miners refused to go back to work. So you have a stalemate, you have a standoff. And the problem is winter is on its way. Okay, winter is rapidly approaching, and TR understands that without the mines operating in Pennsylvania, you're going to have a lot of people cold. You're going to have a lot of people, can die freezing to death because they didn't have the ability to heat their homes. Okay, plus two, those who can get coal at that point in time, it's going to cause the price to shoot up. It's going to screw up the economy. So when you have two sides that neither one is willing to budge, TR came up with an idea that people had not done before. He actually, we'll say called or invited both sides to the White House, but essentially told them, you're coming here. We're going to work this out, period. TR understood that this was an issue that directly affected the American people, and as such, it had to be resolved one way or another as rapidly as possible. He even said that one of the mine owners offended him so much it was only, as he put it, the dignity of the presidency that kept him from grabbing the guy and throwing him out a window. And, we've talked about TR already, going through that gallon of coffee each day. Yeah, it probably would not be beyond him to do that, or probably at the very least, he was probably thinking about punching the guy in the face for all I know. So he calls both sides to the White House, and he's going to force them to come to some kind of an agreement. But both sides really do have their heels dug in. Neither side wants to be the one that budges. The mine owners don't want to give in to the miners. The miners don't want to go back to work. So what does TR do? Threatens to have the government take over the mines. He's going to take the U.S. military, and the soldiers are going to start mining the coal themselves. The miners will be out of work. They're going to be completely out of luck. The mine owners will be out of luck because they're not going to get any money for the coal that's being dug out by the military. Now, once you had this threat, once you had TR threaten both sides with, look, if neither one of you is going to get everything you want, therefore I'll make sure neither of you get anything you want. Magically, both sides agreed to a compromise after that. They both realized that TR was serious, that he would actually go through and use federal troops to work the mines. The miners saw that they had a real shot at losing badly. The mine owners saw that they had a real shot at losing badly. And so they came to some kind of a conclusion. Okay? They came back to the bargaining table. Neither side was overly happy with what they got, but both sides got just enough to make the miners and the mine owners both happy enough. Now, this wasn't a great, happy, sing kumbaya between the mine owners and the miners or anything like that. But it did solve the problem. In fact, it was from that point forward that the federal government would often step in to settle a strike. We have seen this happen a lot throughout the 20th and into the 21st century. And it usually involves some kind of an issue that's going to have a massive effect on the U.S. economy or a massive effect on the American people themselves. So TR really broke the ice on this one. He went through and he, for the first time, didn't exactly side with labor, but he didn't exactly side with business either. He sided with the American people. He didn't care if both sides were happy or unhappy with what was going on. All he wanted was to get the coal out of the ground and going to people's homes once again. He was able to succeed at this, and a lot of people really were able to survive the winter because of his actions. Like I said, this was the first time we'd ever seen it happen, but it certainly wasn't going to be the last time. Teddy Roosevelt had simply been the one to break the ice. Another use of federal power that we're going to see under the Teddy Roosevelt administration is going to be dealing with railroad regulation. Now, remember, we've already talked about this before in different chapters. We've talked about things like Munn v. Illinois. That was one of the Granger cases that we talked about. And we talked about some of the ways that the federal government was trying to regulate railroads. Since they did cross state lines, this gave the Congress the authority to actually put forth some regulations in that it was interstate commerce. Remember, if it crosses a state line, that's interstate commerce, and the federal government can get involved. If it doesn't cross a state line, it's just within one state, that is intrastate commerce, and really the federal government can't do much about that. Now, keep in mind, way back in 1887, which the time frame we're talking about was like 15 years ago, you had the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC. Okay, now that was set up predominantly to go through and regulate the railroads. You had different states had tried to do it, and the argument was, as I just said, if you cross a state line, that's interstate commerce, and that's something that only the federal government has the authority to do. So they had designed this Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, and the whole purpose of this was to try and get some kind of control over the railroads. Now, while this had been created and it had been put in place with the absolute best of intentions and with the highest of hopes, it had really not been very effective whatsoever. So really not a lot had changed since the ICC came into existence in regards to the railroads. The railroads still had a massive amount of power. They still had a great ability to go through and really have their say in politics and local issues and things like that. So one of the things that Teddy Roosevelt did, now keep in mind, a president can't actually create legislation in the Congress, but allies of the president in the Congress can do so. So TR goes through and he pushes through something known as the Hepburn Act of 1906 and other laws like this. Now, you're going to keep in mind, we talked about Robert La Follette. Okay, remember this is the governor of Wisconsin. We had talked about some of the different things that he was trying to change, that he was trying to make better in regards to his state. Well, Teddy Roosevelt is going to do some of the same things on a national scale, okay, with the laws like the Hepburn Act, okay? This limited the distribution of free railroad passes. Now, remember, when we talked about La Follette and trying to, either get rid of or at the very least severely limit the use of free railroad passes, we were talking about the fact that the railroads were using these to essentially bribe legislators in the state of Wisconsin. Well, TR is trying to go through and stop that same type of bribery from happening on a national level. Remember, we talked about the fact that since railroads were the primary means of transporting not just cargo but also people, giving out free railroad passes would be the equivalent today of something like, here, you can borrow my private jet. And, it wasn't a bribe per se, but it was something that would probably be remembered when it came time to vote on a particular bill dealing with the railroads or something like that. So you have this desire of Teddy Roosevelt to go through and again break up some of the trusts in regards to the railroads because he sees them as having too much power and not being responsive to the needs of the people. Again, this is one of those trusts that he sees as a bad thing, that he sees as something harming the American people. If he had not seen it as harmful, he would not have gone after it. But since he did see it that way, that's why he worked very hard on this. And his efforts really ended up in fairer shipping rates and less corruption within the railroad industry itself. So you can see in this situation, Teddy Roosevelt's response to the railroads and his actions actually did have some positive benefits. You did see the railroads start to clean up their own act. There was less corruption. There was less ability to bribe public officials. Remember, we had talked about the Credit Mobilier a while back that they had created their own construction company that was then basically ripping off the government and bribing the government with the money they were being paid by the government. So it was all about tax dollars. Well, that is starting to become a thing of the past. Now, it's not a guarantee that everything is just going to be peachy keen and no problems and everybody's going to link arms and sing kumbaya. But at the same time, things are going to get better. Plus, two, you had better shipping rates now. You didn't have the same stranglehold that the railroads had on farmers before this. So you're seeing different positives. You're seeing ways in which Teddy Roosevelt has gone through and he has used the power of the office of the president to actually change what's happening within the United States itself. Now, of course, we are far from a perfect society at this point in time. We're far from a perfect society in 2020. But again, this was an attempt to make progress to make the United States a better place. Teddy Roosevelt, I've said it several times now, said he would do whatever he had to as long as it wasn't expressly forbidden by the Constitution. And you can see here, this is another example. He has gone through and he's used the power of his office to try and improve the life of everyday Americans. He is pushing for that square deal in that all the people of the United States would have a much better shot at life.